about what resettlement is, the definition of the different type of refugee immigrant statuses, and then kind of the unique challenges and some of the programs we have in our office. And so when you hear the term refugee or immigrant, there can be a variety of different, people that come to your mind. And so really the kind of the families that we work with generally come from these three kind of categories. These are all kind of legal definitions as far as, their immigration status. And so a refugee is one who has been forced to flee their country due to fear of persecution for their religion, ethnicity, nationality, political opinion, or for being a member of a particular social group. And so this is a definition by the UN, and I'll kind of go into that process again of like when they get assigned that. A humanitarian parolee is an individual who may be otherwise ineligible for admission to be in the US, but then they're kind of admitted temporarily for urgent humanitarian reasons. And so some of the people that, this would cover would be like our Ukrainian families who just kind of recently fled because of the war, or, in 2021, we had a lot of Afghans who came kind of after the US withdrew. And then special immigrant visa are those who qualify for a green card under the USCIS Special Immigrant Program. And so in order to apply for this status, the individual must fill out a petition documenting their circumstances. So a lot of the families that we work with who kind of fall under this category, maybe they worked with the US military, in Afghanistan or somewhere else as an interpreter, or, in some other role. And so, and so those are just some of the families that we serve. Other people that, we might interact with are Cuban Haitian entrants, certified foreign-born victims of human trafficking. And then there's other immigration statuses that we serve, especially in our legal clinic and citizenship programs. And so again, all of kind of these families are all eligible for the same social services and public benefits as a US citizen. And so they are here with a document kind of certifying that they are on that path to citizenship. So refugee resettlement is the careful selection by the government of the most vulnerable families that are not able to return to their home country. And so about at the end of 2022, there was an estimate of approximately 29 million refugees worldwide, and less than 1% get that chance to resettle. And so kind of in Kansas City, Kansas, which is kind of the region we cover, the majority of refugees this last year came from Afghanistan, Burma, the Congo, and Ukraine, Cuba. And so in your folders and kind of you'll see this handout that talks about the US resettlement process. And so the journey to resettlement, could begin, sometimes this process can take up to 20 years. It is, starts when a refugee, a family flees their homeland based on those, fears that I had mentioned on that first slide. And so they then will seek protection from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, so that UNHCR, and the protection can kind of come from, either returning to the home country, they might, and at that point is when they would request for that registration as a refugee. In order to receive that, they'll go through a series of interviews, both through the UN, and then, if they are determined to resettle into the US, they would also have an interview with the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. If they are approved, then they'll be allocated to, any of the resettlement agencies kind of nationwide. And so they have to go through a series of medical examinations, cultural orientation. They travel to the US and then are kind of enter in through what we call our reception and placement program. And so these are our primary arrivals, those that we kind of get notification of, okay, this is when they are, arriving on US soil, or they're arriving in Kansas City. We pick them up from the airport and we enroll them into our programs. And so this is kind of just, again, for a reference, the number of refugees, or like kind of where we saw the families that we serve. come from. And so, you know, kind of as I mentioned, some of the higher populations we've seen are from the Democratic Republic of Congo is the highest, Afghanistan, Burma, and then, yeah, when we kind of look at these numbers too, the fiscal year starts in October. And so this is kind of our October through September of 2020, October 22 to September of 23. And then FY24 year to date is really just October through now. So we're you know, steadily increasing our numbers, having more, you know, having received more this year in, you know, the 9 months than we did all of last year. We also have something called secondary families that we work with, and those are maybe they come through a private sponsorship, or they, you know, move. They are initially resettled into Kansas, or sorry, into a different place than Kansas. So it could be Wichita, it could be California. They move, and then we kind of enroll them in our programming. And a majority of those families by far are coming from Cuba. And so we have 160 out of our 339. And then some other kind of families in there as well. As you can see, we received a lot of families from Ukraine last year. So just some unique challenges for both immigrant and refugee families. And really Amy in her presentation is going to talk a little bit more about this as well. But just kind of some things I wanted to highlight are just the understanding new culture, community systems in the US, limited formal education for both adults and for children. Yeah, limited access to English, and then other items as well, depending on, you know, kind of what the resettlement journey was. So we have that traditional, you know, reception and placement where they, you know, may have lived in a camp for 20 plus years. And then we also have families who maybe are resettled much more quickly because of, you know, that parolee status, like immediate things happen. But in some cases, they'll have that poor nutrition, healthcare, experiences of trauma and war. And these are just some of our refugee programming. So all of these slides, as well as different backgrounders talking about these refugee populations, kind of their cultural, their history, are going to be on this kind of shared Google Drive that will be shared with you. So I won't really go all into this. But really what the goals of our programming is to help our families become self-sufficient. So whether that's access to employment, access to community resources to enhance physical and mental health, and through facilitating integration into their communities. And we know that education is a really big piece of that. So I'm gonna end mine a little bit early. The last kind of things I had was about opportunities to help and kind of to get involved. And so again, these slides are going to be online shared with you, but just due to time, I'm gonna go ahead and switch it over to Amy to our next presentation. So, and then she'll have a little bit more opportunity for engagement and discussion. But so thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm Amy Pereira. I'm the Refugee Education Manager. So one of the programs that I oversee is the Refugee School Impact Program. And so that's the program here at Catholic Charities that works with newly arrived refugee families, helping them enroll in the schools, navigate the school system. That includes like parent orientations and helping with school tours and helping them find the bus for their first day. We provide like school supplies like backpacks and notepads and things like that, as well as a summer youth enrichment program. So every year, so children are coming all through the year, right? There's no particular time. We don't get kids coming straight at the beginning of the school year. We get them throughout the year. So if we're getting families coming in mid-May, they've missed the time to be able to start school when they've arrived. So a lot of those kids don't get much engagement during the summer. So we have a summer youth enrichment program, like a summer camp, which works on kind of giving these kids an opportunity to see what the school system's like, learning how to put their hand up in school desks to go to the bathroom or lining up and things like that. These kids often have very low levels of English, especially when they first arrive. And so our camps can be, they can be a lot of fun. There's about 7 or 8 languages being spoken, right? I have my contact information here. I do have some business cards, because we work with about 7 school districts in the area. And so anytime you're working with a refugee and you know that they are actually refugee status and they've been here 0 to 5 years, very often they've come through Catholic Charities if they're here in Kansas. So we're often the ones who have assisted with school enrollment and things like that. So if ever you have any questions, feel free to reach out. So today I was hoping to cover these kind of topics right here, but I realized that we are running a little short on time, so we'll see. But I'll talk a little bit about the experiences of newly arrived refugee families, common challenges that we see with the kids and also with the schools, consequences of trauma. I've got a few case studies as well, and then ways to support families, and I'll try and touch on some volunteer opportunities for this as well. Okay, so as Sarah mentioned, there are lots of different experiences, barriers, boundaries that families experience when they come into the US for the first time. And lots of times families have to learn to understand and navigate a lot of different things. So there's language differences, communication norms and different methods, climates, clothing. We have families from the Congo coming in November who don't have winter jackets and they have like sandals on their feet, right? So these are things that we have to assist with, the differences in housing, different food, banking systems, healthcare systems, the school system, social services. There are just lots of different pieces when people come in. And then to add to all this, there's often a layer of trauma as well, right? So lots of times, these families have to navigate these really complex and profound changes in their like identity and family roles. So perhaps the primary breadwinner was the father, but when they come here, they need both parents working maybe, because maybe they have a large family and financially here that would be needed. So that kind of changes some of their roles. Also, a lot of our kids, they pick up English really quick when they come. And so when they arrive and they pick it up, they become almost like cultural brokers in their family, which isn't great, of course, but these things happen in that way. Children being disciplined in the US can be quite different to the way it is around the world. The jobs that the parents might have might be quite different to what they had before. So for example, back home, they might have had various degrees and certifications that allow them to do various jobs. But when they come here, maybe those don't transfer over, or maybe they have a lower level of English. So there are just lots of pieces. Maybe they have different religious practices that it's difficult for them to practice here. Maybe their communities are going to be different. Maybe they lived closer to family, friends, like a larger community who are helping with raising kids. And here now, who's going to take care of the children when both parents are working? And so there are just lots of different pieces to it. And discrimination is also something that, of course, the adults, but also the children face quite a bit. Okay, so I thought maybe for like 2 minutes, you could talk with the people around you and see if you've noticed any of these challenges while you've been teaching, or things that you've kind of expected to face when working with refugee or newcomer families. So obviously there are going to be a lot of kids in your classes who you don't know whether they're refugees or asylees or whatever their status is, and you should never ask either. But so I'm just thinking in general for newcomer families, like what are some challenges that you've seen? Generally, we like to focus on the strengths and the knowledge and the resources that families bring, but today we're just going to talk a little bit about some of these challenges. So I'll just give you like maybe 2 minutes or so just to talk to people and we can feedback. I have papers as well. Sorry.
They weren't in this. Oh, shit. So I just wondered.
Sorry about that.
I don't know why.
Do you want to stop share and then reshare?
Yeah.
Oh, were you able to figure it out? Oh, good. Yeah, that one, it would be that one. You can also say, do they have the Google Drive? Because you can just send them the link directly to follow it straight from. As long as they don't edit anything at the same time.
Have it be like this.
Yeah, that's all right. That's fine. So I can just press the button, right? Because I'm gonna stop this now. All right. So, what did everyone have? Okay, so let's discuss it a little bit. So does anyone have anything that they want to share? You can put your hand up or yell at me. I'm fine with that too. You were talking a lot.
My biggest concern is always, like, you asked about the gifts that they're bringing, and I always try to figure out, how can I find out what you're bringing? And I feel like there's a lot of blockades, like they're not gonna tell me because there's fear or and so how do I bust that down to say, no, really, I'm excited, tell me about you.
That's a good one. I think the thing with that is there's a few things. Number one is sometimes when families come into the school system, their cultural background might be in such a way that there's a certain level of like distance or respect with the school system compared to the family, right? So they're not thinking that the school are going to be interested in them. The focus is the school are the people who are like higher up, like a hierarchy almost. So I feel like I totally understand that part. And then also the fear. You don't know how people are going to react. So I think it's over time, like creating spaces for kids. I mean, it's easier said than done, right? It's creating spaces for kids, but also families. Like I feel like, for example, the KCKPS school district, they have those migrant education events. And those events, so I've been at some of those events sometimes, which is great. And they have, it's a community resources. And during those, they allow families to like kind of ask questions and things like that. And I think having, for example, focus groups on a larger scale, just having an idea of what would help families or what things they need or what strengths that they have. And then also, yeah, creating spaces in the classroom, making sure children are supported even by their peers to feel safe. So hopefully if we get around to it, I have some case studies and like, one of the things that we see really regularly is kids, when they first go in, not all schools buddy them up or not all schools like connect them with another student. I've had it's not a case study, but it's a real story. All of them are real. But I've had a situation once where I got a phone call from a parent saying, my kids didn't come home from school today. And I was really scared, and it was their first day. And I had gone to the school, I'd helped them go the first day, I'd shown them how to take the bus, I'd show them how to come out. But it was high school and they got lost in high school and they came out the front door rather than the door they meant to go out for the buses. So they had just come out and I guess they missed us and they were just sitting there. And I, went over to the school and they were sitting there. They were like, yeah, we didn't know what to do. And it was because no one, when they had entered that school, I have no ability to actually enter the school, right? So someone on that side had to have been like, hey, these two kids are new. They speak Swahili. This school actually has quite a bit of Swahili speakers. They should have connected someone at that time. So I think problems are that kids are isolated. I have a case study that we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But yeah, it's hard. It is so hard to be able to like show people that you respect and you're excited for their strengths. That is a hard one. But I think it's trying to find ways that they feel comfortable and safe to be able to be themselves or be comfortable. Also, we'll maybe touch on it a little bit, but like there are layers of trauma. And so like we have to be aware of that. We don't want to be digging in, like it's about making a safe space so people feel comfortable. Sorry, anything else?
Yes, you were talking about, reminds me like, I grew up in a dictatorship, but also of these, a lot of these kids are coming from situations of war where you don't know who to trust.
Mm-hmm.
So you give, when you ask a question, you give as little information as possible.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to get in trouble. You don't know who's.
Exactly, you don't know who to trust, and that is completely fair and is completely right. Like it makes sense. It's like a safety mechanism. So yeah, and that's like hard. I think that over time things like that can change as people get used to the country. I do think we see a lot more like success with our younger kids over time. It is harder with our older kids, right? So they have less time in the school district. But that's a really good point. Does anyone else have anything they want to share?
Academically.
Mhm.
So, they come from various countries where we don't always know their academic background, even though they speak one language and one language only, sometimes they still might not be fluent in writing or reading in their native language. And so it's very difficult to teach them English, when they have no phonetic background in their own language. as far as, and also like background knowledge, you know, they may not have the background knowledge of the things that we're trying to teach them, or things like that.
Exactly, and that's a really good example because a lot of our families, well, not a lot, but there are certain amounts of like the adults in the family who might be illiterate, for example, in their own language, or some kids we have who have never had formal education ever. So there are just huge gaps with that, and that is tricky to deal with. Navigating those spaces is hard. So it's finding which level each child is and focusing on that child. It has to be like focus on the individual needs rather than like kind of an umbrella as such. Is there anything else for that? Sarah, do you know if there was anything in the chat by any chance? Oh, sorry. I mean, I can see if I can try and find it here, or not. Because I don't even know if we're sharing the screen.
You are, you're sharing, but there's no question in the chat.
Oh, okay, great, thanks.
Mhm.
So there are lots of different pieces to this, especially because we don't know the level that families have come in. I mean, can you imagine coming somewhere and learning US history for the first time? Like, exactly. So there are lots of different pieces there. Are there any strategies? We won't go into small groups for this, but are there any strategies that people have used to overcome some of these challenges? You know, creating like a safe space, for example, so that children have kind of been able to open up. Have you ever had good positive experiences or successes with anything?
Well, success in a challenge. We've had students that have come from the same area, but because of their either political or cultural or they may speak the same language, but they can't talk to each other because of some something there that I don't understand, because in my world I'm like, no, that doesn't happen, but it does. And so that's a frustration because, you know, we'd love to partner you with this kid, but you can't talk to them because they're female or they're, you know, a different faith or whatever. So
yeah, and that's really hard. And I'm not sure I even know how we would navigate that exactly. But it's useful to actually be able to recognize things like that, because I think, again, if we go in with too many assumptions, I mean, that's not going to work out either, right? So I understand that one. There's a question there.
I was just gonna share.
You were gonna what?
You can ask a question. I was gonna share what.
Yes, please.
Yeah,
sorry.
So I worked with a young girl from Ukraine when I lived in Vermont, and one thing that helped a lot making her feel comfortable, she didn't speak English, she was very nervous and she had a lot of behavior problems, and sharing her a little bit of her culture with her classmates every day. So we got everyone together and we made borscht in the cafeteria and we shared a word of the day in Ukrainian. And that really helped her feel comfortable, like she wasn't an outsider. So there was this cultural exchange happening.
That's awesome. I feel like that's a great idea. I feel like a lot of times it's hard because your classes are so big, you have so many different kids. So it's hard to be able to give that space and time, but that's a great way to create space, to give the opportunity to engage and then share their own culture and then their own strengths. These are pieces of their strength. That's something that she knows. She knows the language, so she can share that. So that's actually, in a case study we later speak about, there's a child who came into the US and her level of English was very low, but she was really good at music. So she was able to like really do well in music, but that was where she was shining. The other stuff, her grades weren't great, but that was where she was able to like contribute. So I think it's finding what, especially like when people first come in, their language level is going to be quite low most of the time. So finding other pieces within the school day that they can contribute. I think there was a comment over here, yeah.
This is when I taught music in Boston, but like there was this little first grader who was always humming something, and so I was like, okay, and so I started humming it with her, and then she taught me the Portuguese badly on my behalf, but it made her feel really smart and sharing, and I also did that with Haitian students. Nice. So they could teach me one of their songs, and then I was bad at it, which is also really good, because I was, you know, and they got to feel smart and sharing.
Exactly. It's like highlighting the strengths, right? So yeah, I think that that's another great story, is being able to like give people the space to be like, hey, you can be you and you can like express yourself. So that's good. I'm gonna move on. Okay, so these are some common challenges that we see that come from the parents, the children, the schools. Obviously it's a Venn diagram as if there's just overlap. The reality is all of this interacts with everything. There wasn't any one way. Like, for example, the family's lack of transportation is going to affect the children, but it's also going to affect school, right? So these are just some examples of the challenges that we have seen. We see that the children very often become cultural brokers within a couple of months. And I mean, that's really tough to be putting the children in that spot. They shouldn't have to do that. That's not their job. But this is something that we see a lot. We see communication difficulties for everyone. This can be tough because, for example, a lot of the school districts use a lot of these online platforms, Infinite Campus, Parent View, Skyward, and a lot of our families have a low level of digital literacy. So never mind the language barrier that's already present from these online systems, because a lot of them don't actually have the language opportunities for a lot of our families. They also are not used to, using technology at all. So that can be hard because that takes away a channel of communication that our families would normally have with the school. And a lot of schools mainly communicate through that way. So we see a lot of families missing out information about what's going on with their child, missing information about their grades, not knowing about field trips, not knowing about various different aspects of their life. Like I said, children come throughout the year. So we're doing mid-school year enrollments. Now, can you imagine going in, like even for us, coming into, with the language that we know, coming into school in the middle of the school year, that already brings a lot of anxiety and stress, but also it's hard for the schools slotting them into classes and things like that. Insufficient student records. A lot of our families do not have birth certificates. So when we're helping enrolling them, we're using an I-94. And they also don't have transcripts for school, or immunizations are missing. So there's sometimes a delay. Things just take a bit more time sometimes when we're working with families. I had a situation where I was enrolling a child in a school district that we had not worked with before. And it took us an additional month. So we're meant to enroll kids in the space of 30 days. That's what we aim to do. But it took us an additional month to enroll them in the school district because the school district didn't believe that the child was from the parents, because they had different last names. So that's really common for some of our families to have different last names, and they didn't have a birth certificate. So here I am with just I-94s. The school district was like, no, we need proof that this is the guardian. We need proof. So these things are tricky, and we're always navigating these pieces, but just recognizing that these are things that you're going to notice. Like the transcripts is a hard one because we have 17-year-olds who come in and they've been to high school, but they can't get into school here. They have to go straight to 9th grade, right? So there are a lot of pieces with that. Yeah, bullying we see. So after we've enrolled kids within the first like 3 months, I think the things that we start seeing from families or sometimes the school is bullying, truancy. These are things that pop up, trauma responses, behavioral things. Yeah, so this is just some of these examples. I'm sure you've seen a lot more, and like I said, they all intersect. I'm going to touch really briefly on trauma because I'm sure all of you have had some form of workshop or educational piece about trauma, but as we know, trauma can have debilitating long-term effects on children and their developing brains. Yeah, and so 1 in 4 children who attend school has been exposed to a traumatic event. So the thing with trauma is that it is going to cause a lot of issues for like, in terms of education, for learning, for behavioral responses. There are lots of different pieces that trauma can create after that. I have all my sorry, Sarah, the front desk is calling me.
Okay.
Yeah, so, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so trauma has a lot of different effects for our families. Some of the different things that we see specifically in the classroom. So I actually have put this child trauma toolkit for educators on the Google Drive. I personally think it's a really good tool, but they talk about the different trauma responses that you see in the school system, in classrooms. So for example, it can affect, it can impact your school performance. I think we were talking a bit about that, like being able to continue with grade placements, continue with high GPAs. They can have higher levels of dropout. Literacy levels can be low. Then you have the impairment on learning. So for example, it can affect like concentration, focus, memory, as well as emotional and physical distress. So some children might have reactions to smaller spaces. They can feel like they're being watched a lot. They can feel they can be under reacting or overreacting to stimuli. So for example, the bell goes or someone yells and they don't react. There are things to be like keeping an eye on. I have put quite a few resources in that Google Drive for you to like better have a chance to look through. Yes. So there are quite a lot of different ways to help children who have been traumatized, but it is all based on the individual needs of the child. So one child reacting with trauma responses is going to be quite different, maybe from another child. And also there's going to be different triggers. And you have to really remember that you will be absorbing a lot of this trauma as educators. Like you will be taking on that secondary trauma and that compassion fatigue. So recognizing that and giving yourself that self-care and looking for support is really, really important. So yeah, for example, if you feel that there's a child who has perhaps experienced some traumas and they're reacting in a certain way, and it may be something abuse related, you all know this, but you should definitely use your reporting procedures, your mandated reporters, work with the child's caregiver if they're not associated with that, and like to share and address school problems, because sometimes there are lots of cultural differences or expectations between the families and the schools. For example, maybe families are not fully aware how important attendance is in the US. In the US, we have very strict rules about that, but not everywhere else. And so making sure that we understand or bridge that kind of gap. So here at Catholic Charities, we provide parent orientations, and we're working with families and talking about what the school would expect and what's expected of the parent. And so we do spend some time with families talking through these things. However, that's in that first 90 days. So in that 90 days, they're also getting their bank account, they're also getting their health sorted, they're also getting housing set up. There's loads of things happening for our families. So sometimes, learning this information and then experiencing it can be quite different. So just kind of recognizing these things will come up. Referring to community resources when a child shows any signs of being unable to cope with traumatic stress. I think resources in general are pretty helpful for not just if a child has any form of traumatic response. Also, if you are working with a family and you're not sure, maybe there's some cultural differences, maybe there's something you're not sure how to navigate, you should definitely tap into what there is. Like here at Catholic Charities, if you are working with any refugees, asylees, or you're not sure, you can always reach out. I'm really happy to try and answer some questions and see if we can help navigate this. But also the school districts have different things. They've got the migrant education program. They have those community outreach workers, at least in KCKPS, they have like bilingual community outreach workers, and they have been a huge help to bridge those gaps, the cultural gaps. So just kind of recognizing these things. Like I said, that toolkit is going to be in the Google Drive, so you can take a look. Okay, so I thought we would do, maybe a case study or two. So I was thinking maybe you could like turn to the people behind you, and then those four you can go together. And I'm going to give this half of the room is going to be case study 1. So I'm just going to hand this here, and then this side here, you guys can do case study 2. Okay. So just hand out a few. And there's not enough for everyone. I think there's probably about 15 copies there, so you might share between people, and I'll give you a few minutes. So these, and so for those online, you could look at case study 1. And then over there, I guess, if they have it. Okay, so take some time to talk. I'll give you about 5 minutes.
How many do we have online? Do you know?
Yes. And they're going to do case study 1.
Is that counting Charlotte? Oh, it might be. Do we have 4 total or?
There's 2.
We were hoping some more people were going to join that.
It looks like 3, including Charlotte.
3, including Charlotte. Okay.
You should all be done too. Yeah. Are these extra? What do you need them? There's extra, so you can take as many as you need. I think it's fine. Some extra.
If you're that much older than my age, teachers are staying. Especially.
The translation.
They have I mean, I'm a principal and teacher, but because that's something about like she's like,
We just start with numbers first and then count. Yeah, I think that I you know, belonging. You know. So, you know, intense.
We don't know if it's a like case or just that very end where they're saying about like they would not get her to that 40% of the grade. Yeah, I mean, we've heard that she's going to lose her organization and it could be just this class that she has to get lost that's motivating her. She's having some stuff going on now she's failing because she didn't have the tools to get her to.
All right, so 1 minute left if you need. I'm gonna show you what happened. Like what this is real. Yeah, this is yeah, these every case study, and I made 4 and I have like millions every day, every week. So this is a real one. So yeah, I mean I can't wait to meet it. Well, wait until you like it's just all right, okay, we're going to share a little bit about what we were talking about. So first, so this half of the room, I think you did case study 1, right?
Yes.
Could someone share like either a brief synopsis of case study 1 or they can read it so that the other half of the room kind of get a background? Anyone want to do that?
Sure, I can do that.
Thank you.
A teacher has been sending notes home to school about a child's frequent absence or lateness to their class. So it finally gets to the mother takes the note to the caseworker, and then the caseworker sets up a meeting with school, and the child only speaks Swahili, and mom only speaks Swahili, and so she says that they need an interpreter, but the teacher is resistant to bringing in an interpreter, but then the caseworker convinces them, and so at the meeting, the mom finds out that the note that she's been sending home that was only in English, she finds out that the reason is because he's been missing or late to school for 3 weeks. Just at her class, or just to this teacher's class, nobody else's class.
Okay. That was really helpful. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, these are all real. These are all real examples, by the way. What were the responses that we had from this side of the room? What was the why do you think he was late or not attending this particular class, or what was happening there?
I think he didn't know that it was required, or he didn't know he was in the class.
Okay.
I think he probably, at least in my head, it's something that he saw as, well, this is my break time, this is when I get to study, or this is when I have an opportunity to be somewhere else. He didn't see it as, oh, I'm supposed to be in room 132 for this next hour. It says world languages, or it says, science, and I don't know what that is, so I don't go.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Anyone else have anything different? Yeah.
Well, we talked about bullying, maybe not only from peers, but maybe the teacher themselves. I mean, I'm sorry, but I've run into racist teachers.
Yeah.
The kids say, they tell me that teacher's racist. She gives me dirty looks. She doesn't like me speaking Spanish.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have unfortunately run into the similar situation before. That's another good thought. Anything else?
We agree with that, and because of the fact that the teacher was reluctant to use the translation service, we thought that something was going on with the instructor.
I will say, I would say that like 80% of my job is advocating for interpretation in schools. So this is actually a bigger issue. One of the reasons people don't do it is because they're not trained. Lots of the schools only train like certain admin staff. It doesn't seem like most of the teachers necessarily get that training. So they don't always know about their specific interpretation. Sorry, you had your hand up.
Well, two things. Number one, we were talking about maybe in this classroom that this student doesn't have the skill level that everyone else does, and they feel a deficit and they feel embarrassed, and there's kind of a stigma, so that they want to avoid that. Also, I did have in high school a case where I had to have a meeting with a mom and dad that were from Korea, and we got an interpreter, and it was beautiful because the student was interpreting for his perspective what I was trying to communicate to the parents. And they did, with an interpreter, they saw my side of it, and they were like, that's not, they were saying to the son, that's not what you've been telling us.
Yeah, that's
not what you've been telling us.
I mean, I will add that the child didn't tell his mom, right? She got all these letters, right? And he's missing one. Go on. Sorry.
Adding to what you said, it could be something in this particular subject that brings up trauma, or it could be just difficult, like if it's an ELA class and he doesn't speak English, then that class is particularly challenging, versus say a math class where there's more context that could be overcome without knowing English. But also if it's like a history class and they're talking about World War II or something, and it's bringing up memories of being in a war, maybe that's particularly stressful.
Exactly, and that kind of also adds on to the whole traumas, layers and things like that, because we just don't always know what the triggers are gonna be, and I mean, that just makes it really hard, but that is definitely something that it could be.
Brings to mind, it could be a PE class, or what do I wear?
Oh yeah, okay, that's a good point. That's actually a really good point. So I'm gonna show you what happened, I'm gonna read you what happened in a minute. All of these things are very likely though to be pieces of it. I'm gonna just tell you what happened in terms of, as the caseworker, what happened next, okay? And I will just try and read it if it comes up. Okay, we're just gonna keep that like that. Okay, so the teacher explained that the student, was often found wandering the hallways in another part of the school during her class. Dorika's son, his name is Ushindi, was present for the meeting as well, and had explained to the teacher that he had tried to go to the class multiple times, but because the schedule alternated like weekly, he often got lost in the school and could not find his way to the class. Now remember, we're in like week 3 or something here. The teacher told him that he should have just asked for help. He should be asking. Why is he not asking? And he went on to explain that he had tried to ask a teacher and other students a few times, but the students laughed at him since he did not speak English, and that the teacher looked blankly when he'd asked and continued to just speak English, and he could not understand them. He said that he felt embarrassed and nervous. So we're still, yes, it's 3 weeks, like, yes, we should be fixing this immediately, but with a changing schedule, it would be week 3 that you would start noticing things, right? So yeah, so this is what happened. Now there could have been other pieces. The fact that the teacher was kind of reluctant about interpretation, the fact that she suggested he just ask for help, you can't imagine, you can't imagine the kind of experience the child is going to even enter that classroom, right? So there are lots of pieces to this. I was the person in this, I was the caseworker here for this situation. And the teacher came out to tell me this as well. So when we go to these appointments, we don't actually come with the family unless they request specifically, because I'm just there to help navigate that situation. I'm not a caseworker, a social worker at the school. I'm not a teacher. I don't want to be part of that unless they need me. So the teacher had asked for me to come in, and I asked the parent, and the parent said, okay, yeah, please figure out what this situation is. They had an interpreter, and the teacher just could not understand why this child wouldn't just ask, as the child is sitting there quietly. So yeah, so that was an example. Let's move on to, are there any other comments about this one you want to add?
When you are looking for a translator, I mean, we've had difficulty trying to find people that can translate in, especially a lot of our dialects that aren't super common. Mandarin being one that I've had several issues with. What resources, like, where do we go?
Okay. Do you mind telling me which school district?
I'm in Shawnee Mission.
Okay, so Shawnee Mission School District, they have contracted interpreters as well. Every school district has to provide interpretation and translation services. It's Title VI of the case, the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So that is a requirement, but the problem is there's not enough training and access for people. So it's hard, and every year they kind of change because it's based on how they use the funding. So KCKPS uses ProPO. Shawnee Mission School District have their own interpreters, and they have in-person interpretation, and it's really great, but access to it is hard. So in addition to having those, for smaller things, you can use Tarjimly. Maybe Kristen, actually, are you going to be talking about the kind of resources?
I'm not sure if I left that in.
Okay, that's fine. So yeah, so there's something called Tarjimly. There is, I'll maybe write it over there on that board after. Tarjimly, you can try with Google Translate. These are things for just small things. I think for for meetings with families and things, you need to be really, we need to try and get a contractor. And actually that's something you can advocate for with your school, because if they say, oh no, we don't have the funds, they have to, right? And that I have seen that a lot. I've seen that a lot with school districts or schools saying, oh no, we don't have the funds, but it's often they just don't know about the resources, or there's a fund issue, but that has to be something they put more money into. Some school districts have huge amounts of diversity, but they're making it different, so it doesn't make sense. So definitely advocate for that. Yeah, Tarjimly, then there's Google Translate, and there's a few other things. I'll think about it when Kristen's talking. Let's move on to case study number 2. Could someone summarize that on this side? I don't feel excited to do so. I can try and summarize it if you want. Okay, so there is a student, Sue Lang. She starts school mid-semester and she's in 9th grade, but she is 17. Because she doesn't have transcripts from her previous school. When she comes into the school district, she has very little English, and within the first month at school, there is a parent-teacher conference, and so the family needed transportation. So a caseworker here took the parents to the parent-teacher conference, as they were meeting different teachers. So this is high school, right? So there's different stations that the family go to speak to different teachers. The caseworker, like I said, the majority of our job is actually advocating for interpretation. Advocated so that each of these meetings had an interpreter. And so some of the teachers were a bit unfamiliar, some pushed back, but there was one teacher who was really happy, and once they got it all set up, was really excited to tell the parents that their child was doing a great job in music. She was a star pupil. She was getting A's. It was her favorite class. And her parents were really happy to hear this. Now, this is a new child who's just come in mid-semester. They're worried about how she's gonna adapt and navigate. She's older than a lot of the kids. There's a lot of things they were concerned about, but they were happy that this is a good thing. So they are talking to the parents, and the teacher's talking to the parents, and the teacher mentions, oh yeah, and also there's this like 40% of your final grade is gonna have this music performance in the evening. It's gonna be in like 2 weeks. We're excited because she's gonna be a main singer. I'm sure she's gonna ace that. This is gonna be great. The parents get excited. They're like, this is so exciting. So they come back to the caseworker and they say, hey, like this went really well. They said that there's a performance and it's gonna be a big part of her grade. We wanna go, can you take us? Now, when families come in, they don't have transportation. They often don't have driver's license yet. And this child is a bus rider, okay? What problem do you think arose for this class, for this student? This side. I might have given it away with the bus rider, but go on. Yes?
How to legally get her there. As a teacher, you can't pick anybody up in your car. So at a previous school, we would actually like have a sit-in and order pizza in for all the kids that couldn't get transportation. So it's gonna be a problem with legal transportation.
Okay, so yeah.
And probably a uniform, because you're usually doing a choir concert with some kind of slogan.
Okay, that's a good one. That's anything else from this side?
Well, if it's 40% of her grade and she's unable to attend, that's a real issue. I mean, how do you?
Thank you. That is great, and that's how I felt. Yeah, it's unfair. 40% of the grade. How's she gonna attend? Anything else?
Well, it would affect her motivation. Like she's excited that she's doing well in a class, and now she's being punished for something that's out of her control.
Great. Anything else?
And also something that just came to me was she's 17 years old. I'm afraid that she's going to receive backlash if she's a main performer and everybody's like, well, how old's this kid? You know, like, why isn't my kid that's actually supposed to be in 9th grade a main performer?
Again, like I said before, all of these could be true. But I'm going to tell you what happened from what we see, but we don't see all the other pieces of it. But yeah, yeah, all of these things. Unfortunately for this one, the caseworker took the family back to the teacher to clarify, because as soon as the caseworker heard this, they thought, oh, wait a minute, this is unusual. It's a performance out of school hours, and they're asking for transportation. How is that child going to get home? So they took them back to clarify that the performance was in fact in the evening and asked whether the school had organized transportation back home for Sue Lang to attend this performance, since she was a bus rider and her family did not have any transportation. The teacher said that it was the responsibility of the family to transport the child back home after the concert. The parents mentioned that since they did not have transportation, their child would have to miss the concert and would therefore not be able to attain the 40% of their grade. The teacher said that he would create an extra credit assignment for her, but it would involve writing an essay in English. This meant that Sue Lang would most likely drop down from being an A student in the class, since English writing was quite difficult for her at this time. The teacher apologized and said that was the only other option. That is what happened. You have done a little differently, hopefully, in this situation as a teacher. I mean, I'm sure you would have done something different. Yes.
I'm just wondering how a musical performance translates to writing an essay. Like if she couldn't make it, there's nothing I could do about transportation. Why not then have her do a performance, something similar? We know that's her skill, that she's excelling in singing. So why would I say, okay, you know, you're a great basketball player, so I'm gonna have you make up your missed game by dancing ballet.
I agree with you. I don't know. It did. I agree. That's again how I felt. And we asked that with the family. We said, was there any other opportunity for another performance during the school day or something like this, maybe during their class? But the teacher was pretty like set on it and said, oh, that's a shame. Oh, what, you know? But it's like that teacher may not recognize that this child is not doing well in her other classes due to the language already. And this is like her shining moment. So yeah, so unfortunately that was that was a real situation. I have more case studies, but I don't have time. So you guys can go through the PowerPoint and look at them for curiosity. And let's see. These are different ways that you can support families. I'm gonna blitz through them. Make sure you try and understand the backgrounds of your families and your students that you work with. Don't put all newcomers in a box. I know we've already talked a bit about that. It's also important not to ask immigration status or anything like that. You just need to be aware of like the backgrounds and some of the experiences families might have. Empowering families, recognizing that they have different needs, different strengths, find out actually what they need rather than just making entirely on assumptions. There was another case study where you'll learn that a child nearly went to truancy court because the teacher just assumed the family wouldn't like understand what she was saying. So rather than contacting, yeah. So there are things that we see all the time because of assumptions, and very often negative assumptions cause that. Be aware of trauma responses, use the different school district departments for support assistance. Like I said, community outreach workers, migrant education programs, school district interpretation services. Again, it's the law, and I've actually included that in the Google Drive, like a document about it being the law. So if you're having issues at school about it, you just kind of casually bring that up. Secondary trauma, take care of yourselves. Practice compassion and gentleness. Another big thing, I know I'm blitzing real fast, is using WhatsApp. So a lot of the kids that the families we work with don't have, they have a cell phone, we help them set up a cell phone, but they don't renew their service or they don't use it very often. And so you'll call and it'll be disconnected. But if you download WhatsApp, WhatsApp is a free messaging app, very easy to use messages and calls through it. It's also an app. So technically it means that it could be separated from your work-life balance because you could only access the app to be able to see the messages. That's how a lot of our families communicate back home. So lots of them maintain their WhatsApp through Wi-Fi and things. So that's a really good help. I know I said all these tough challenges. There are also really great things that we see with our families. I feel like there's a huge amount of resiliency with these kids, a lot of strength. We have a great time at summer camp every year. I love going for parent-teacher conferences, like within 2 months of the kids starting, because when they first start, they're so nervous and shy. And then parent-teacher conference, they will not be quiet in the car. They'll be showing me all the pictures from school and things like that. So there's a lot of great strengths that families have. Yeah, so I didn't want to leave on a negative note. Yeah, and if you want to volunteer with us, you can go to the website. There are lots of different opportunities. For our program specifically, we're always looking for transportation assistance for parent-teacher conferences, and then summer camp, we're always looking for like people who would love to be involved as like counselors as such. It's only 1 week, and you can always schedule to just come in for half a day. Yeah, and our ELL program is always looking for tutors. Okay, sorry. The PowerPoint's online, so feel free to look at it whenever, and I have some business cards and my contact info there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy, for that incredible presentation. Thank you again. Yeah, maybe we'll have some of that stuff on the way out. So our next presentation is going to be our program director for New Roots. And so I'll have her introduce herself, and we'll be talking a little bit about language access and working with interpreters. So are there anything, yeah, let me just check real quick. Anything coming from the chat? It looks like we have a few things. Okay, great. And so I will hand it over to Kristen. Do you want to come on?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So like Sarah said, my name is Kristen Selby. I'm the program director of New Roots, our farmer training program, which we're gonna have an opportunity to tour right after this. I'm going till 10:50. Is that correct? What I'm shooting for? Okay. Is there a way to make that full screen? Okay. So what I'm going to be covering today is talking about the concept of language access and, making sure that everyone in a room is able to communicate in a language that they feel comfortable in. So that concept. And then talking about working with interpreters and how to utilize an interpreter. And then one of the kind of main skills with working with an interpreter, particularly community-based interpreters, is using plain language in your communication, which is also helpful in communicating with English language learners as well. So my talk will be more relevant to your work with parents, but also with children and using plain language if they're not English language learners. And I know that there are some like ELL instructors in the room today. Is there like one, I don't know, just to get a concept from the room, like plain language, language access, and working with interpreters, what is like the thing that's most relevant to you that I can kind of be sure to spend the most time on? Or are all three helpful? All three. Okay, we'll just kind of spread it out evenly then. All right, so today we're talking about language access, and related to this idea is the idea of language justice. I'm gonna scoop this over a little bit if I can. Okay. So language justice is the right everyone has to communicate in a language in which we feel most comfortable. It's about building and sustaining multilingual spaces. So recognizing the social and political dimensions of language and language access while working to dismantle language barriers, equalize power dynamics, and build strong communities for social and racial justice. So in a room where English is the dominant language, there's going to be a power dynamic with those who don't speak English. And so language justice is about trying to equalize those power dynamics as much as it's in our power. And creating multilingual spaces, benefits everyone. It strengthens our communities through diversity. There's a lot of benefits other than just the inherent value of language justice, of having these multilingual spaces and having everybody included. Have you heard of this concept before? Or what would language justice or a multilingual space look like in action in your work? Is that something you've seen before, or is that something you could envision happening in your classroom or in your work? Do you feel like your, classrooms are currently multilingual spaces?
We've had things come up in our school where teachers are uncomfortable with kids speaking Spanish in their classroom. Or they're not sure, and so we have had like conversations, school-wide conversations, or team conversations about allowing that, and so that has been kind of controversial.
Okay,
yeah,
interesting.
I try to bring in, I teach science, and when we talk about root words, a lot of times I try to bring in the very little other languages I know, and especially when I'm like, okay, so we talk about the corona around the sun. Oh, wait, I know that from Spanish. Oh my gosh, this is something. And so I like to try to see what do I know that I can link in. Now, of course, when you talk about Swahili, I got nothing. It's not that I wouldn't love to learn, it's that I don't know how to incorporate that, so.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I love that example of incorporating, a student's language into what's going on. I think that creates like a really welcoming environment. Yeah, and I can see how it would be controversial because it's not easy, definitely, right? Like the easiest thing is just if everybody speaks the same language. But so I'm not by any means saying that this work is easy, but it can be a really beautiful and helpful thing. So with the work that I do when we teach a class to the New Roots farmers, there's usually about 3 different languages present. And so we have somebody instructing in English, and then we have different groups of people. And so the instructor will say something, and then each interpretation group will pause for interpretation. So that's just sort of one picture of what a multilingual space can look like, where there's an exchange of languages. And it does take longer, but everybody is able to communicate and listen, and it can be a really awesome thing. So one way to kind of work towards this language justice and language access is by using plain language and plain communication. So I'm going to offer some definitions of that and then some tips on how to utilize plain language. So plain language ensures that the listener understands as quickly, easily, and completely as possible. Plain language strives to be easy to understand and use. When you use plain language, you avoid wordy or confusing language or really specific jargon. A communication is in plain language if the language, structure, and design are so clear that the intended audience can easily find what they need, understand what they find, and use that information. So those are kind of the goals. And whether you're, speaking with an interpreter to a family or not, if it's just not possible to access an interpreter, plain language is still a valuable skill. Because if someone has, a little bit of English, if you can kind of condense that down into more plain language, communication is more possible. So today I'm just going to go through 7 elements of plain communication, and we'll talk about some examples of each to just kind of take away a few tools. So these are the 7 that I'll be going through. And there's a handout with a graphic there. And obviously my work is dealing with agriculture. So there's like agricultural terms on there. So that's why it's kind of specific like that on the first side with the yellow background. So number 1 is to use language or familiar use everyday language or familiar words. So this is, I should have outlined this in red. This was from a training where they were talking about the chemical properties of soil, and they use this vocabulary: vegetative growth, green leafy shoots, and vigorous stems. Basically saying like, this is what nitrogen does to a plant. So, what's another word for vigorous? Strong, exactly. So using the word strong instead of vigorous. Vegetative growth and green leafy shoots. Those are kind of similar things. And so I would condense that into just, maybe green leafy plants or something like that. Just making that language a little more simple. It's not necessary to use those more convoluted words. Here's one that, it's not necessarily complicated, but it's a little bit jargony, like reach out to. So what could you say instead of that to make it a little more plain?
Talk.
Yeah, talk, call, right? Talk would also be good. What about hash it out? Yeah, talk about, yep. Okay, I saw this on like it was like a farmer's market application. It was like, your table can't encroach on the pathway. But what is that? What word you could use instead? Step over, cross, block. Okay, so just taking the time to think about the language that you're using and making it a little more everyday and familiar is a key part of plain language. All right, number 2 is to use short sentences. So this was something I saw on again, it's a farmer's market thing. So just very long sentences. The text is very smushed and it's not as easy to read. So I just took this and I broke it out into like shorter sentences, not even sentences, like little chunks of information. And so thinking about maybe if you're creating a flyer or a graphic, having it more short chunks of information. So this goes for writing as well as for speaking. And I'm going to show you an example later of someone working actually with an interpreter, but using those short sentences, doing, 2 or 3 sentences at a time and then pausing for interpretation is great. And the shorter the sentence, the better. And then choose words with fewer syllables. So what's another sufficient? That's kind of a long word. What's maybe a shorter word to use than sufficient?
Enough.
Right. Okay. What about experiment? Try, yeah, or test. Good. Curriculum. That's, teachers are gonna, classes, learning, lessons, classwork. And so I'll say here, like, so these are just some examples of using words with fewer syllables. Sometimes you are going to have like a word that is unavoidable, that, you know, you're just not going to be able to break down further. So, you know, in the case, like if you're doing a presentation or something, a lesson, identifying those key vocabulary words and defining them at the beginning, using pictures if possible. Because I understand, you know, you're not always going to be able to break it down into a simpler word, but kind of defining those up front is really helpful. If you're kind of communicating with a parent, making sure that if a word like that comes up, that it's able to be translated. If not, you know, kind of explaining what the word means and then like moving forward from there. So remove repetitive language. So this was an example that's on the handout. Put the sweet potato slips in the ground and plant them. Okay, so how could you just remove some repetition in that sentence?
Plant the
potato slips.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, like I wouldn't even on first glance think that that is like a bad sentence necessarily. So it's just sort of about like editing yourself and going through that process of like, okay, how can we make this a little simpler? It is important for students to complete homework in a timely manner and turn in all assignments on or before the due date.
Do your homework.
Right, exactly. Yeah, do your homework. Students need to turn in homework assignments on time. And you could actually, I would take out assignments of there, right?
Right.
Yeah. Turn in homework on time or do your homework. That's perfect. And then use active voice rather than passive voice. So active voice is when the subject of a sentence does something and the verb is in the active voice. When the subject of the verb receives the action, the verb is in passive voice. So for example, the content of any signage in a vendor's booth is limited to information that is relevant to products or the business. So we have that kind of is limited, which is, you know, this is sort of, the whole thing is sort of a passive. And so when you change it to limit signage to information that is relevant, you're making the action right up front. Okay, what about this example? Price signs should be displayed before the start of market. How could you display? Exactly, display. Exactly, yeah. So thinking about that, that active voice is helpful. It makes language and your sentences and your usage a little more easy to understand. And this is sort of related to that. It'll help you put things in active voice if you use you. So meetings with the teacher can be requested. Again, that's in passive voice. How could you make it active and use you in it?
You can request a meeting with a teacher.
Exactly. All right, this is another farm example. Garlic scapes can be eaten or sold at the market.
You can eat or sell.
Right. And so that's just, you know, an easier way to identify what's going on, the meaning of the sentence, if you use you and using that active voice. All right, and then number 7 is to avoid extra detail. This is one I'm definitely guilty of, especially like when I'm in front of a group of people, you know, you kind of want to fill the silence. And so this is one that's harder for me and I think is helpful, you know, if you create a presentation first and then look back and reflect on where you can avoid extra detail. That's been a helpful tool for me. So this was an example. The first sentence was sun-dried peppers for a long time, at least 14 hours. You know, you can take that out and just make it shorter. Okay, from this sentence, how could you avoid extra detail? We need to find a restaurant that serves delicious food, has a clean and spacious environment, offers vegetarian options, and is affordable.
Could you do bullets like you did before?
That would work. This is kind of changing the content of a sentence and just making it simpler. So you could say we need to find a good, affordable restaurant with vegetarian options. So instead of restaurant that serves delicious food, we just said good. And has a clean and spacious environment.
It's good, yeah.
Yeah, good. Which is, subjective. So it depends on what you're talking about. Maybe you're talking to someone who like their definition of a good restaurant would be different. So sometimes you have to have that extra detail, but this just sort of is an example of condensing that. There's a bakery around the corner that sells amazing cupcakes with fluffy vanilla frosting and sprinkles that look like tiny jewels. There's a good bakery. Yeah.
This bakery has cupcakes.
Right, exactly, yeah. Now, if like you're an ELA teacher, maybe you really like this sentence because it has a lot of description. So it has its place, but when we're talking about communicating across a language barrier, avoid that extra detail. So basically, plain language, the question you should ask yourself is, can the intended audience easily find what they need, understand what they find, and use that information? So again, what I have found helpful in my work is creating a script when I teach, and just trying to stick to the script, which will help you avoid that extra detail. It'll help you look at your language. So just kind of going back through when you're preparing a lesson, and editing down for plain language. And then if it's maybe say like a meeting with teachers, with parents, creating a really clear agenda, and thinking about the topics that you're gonna talk about and the language that you're going to use, and choosing that plain language. In the drive, I put several resources for looking into plain language further, so you can find some links there. All right, so now I'm going to talk about working with interpreters. So Amy mentioned that the KCK school district uses Propio, but it sounds like Shawnee Mission has contracted interpreters. So Amy, that's like similar to what we do, correct? So it's going to be like folks in the community.
Yeah, to some level.
Okay.
I think they do require like certain requirements to be an interpreter for like SMSD and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to get a little context. Are those the two school districts that y'all are working in? No, it's Blue Valley.
And I know they have a list of interpreters.
Okay.
Blue Valley does the same as SMSD. Blue Valley, Olathe, SMSD, they do like a similar.
Okay.
concept.
Okay. The reason I asked that is because there will be, especially when you're working with community interpreters, there may be a big variation in their experience as interpreters. And so with Propio, I don't have as much experience, but I feel like those folks can be more advanced, maybe. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And so plain language is also helpful with working interpreters. In my experience, there are some interpreters that, their English isn't like 100% proficient. And so using plain language through interpretation is also really helpful, and just making sure that the meaning is getting across. Would anyone be willing to share like what their experience is working with an interpreter, or what you think is important when working with an interpreter?
Volunteer. Go slow and pause a lot.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great. Yeah.
I was also asked to provide an outline or any notes to them ahead of time so they could kind of see what we were going to be talking about and maybe even practice.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, we have interpreters. On our team, we have interpreters, and we'll put out an agenda before the meeting, and I see they'll work on their computers and they'll be like typing notes in their language beforehand. So if it's possible to send notes beforehand, that's a really great tip. Could I just get a show of hands who has utilized an interpreter before? Okay, great. All right, so before the meeting where you're going to utilize an interpreter, identify if participants need interpretation, of course. So I just want to also talk about consecutive versus simultaneous interpretation, especially for those who haven't had experience. So like what you might see, I don't know, the example I always think of, like you see like the UN, and you know, it's like it's going on simultaneously. People have those like headphones and everything is happening at the same time. That has never been my experience with interpretation. It's always consecutive. So one language is spoken and then interpreted, and then spoken and then interpreted. And so it's usually about double the amount of time as if you know, two people are speaking the same language. Just for your reference, interpretation refers to verbal interpretation of two languages, and then translation is usually referring to a written transfer of languages. Of course, you'll want to schedule the interpreter before the meeting. I usually try to schedule interpreters at least a week in advance. I think that sort of depends on, you know, your resources, but definitely do it in advance if possible. If you have a language line though, you know, obviously that can happen in the moment. Like you were saying, create an agenda with notes in plain language so that the interpreter can follow along and maybe prepare ahead of time. And then introduce the client, the parent, you know, whoever you're working with, and the interpreter. So make sure that they connect. And then if you're in a meeting where there's a mix of languages, just set the expectation with the group. Let others at the meeting know that an interpreter is present. Set expectations for the pace of the meeting and the fact that the meeting is going to look a little different. I've been in situations like at a farmer's market meeting where there was an interpreter, but not everybody realized that. And so they're like looking back, you know, they thought these people were just like chatting and being a distraction. And so kind of setting up that expectation, like, all right, there's going to be, you know, other people talking, which seems small, but, you know, it's helpful. And then set up the space. So make sure that the interpreter can hear you and the other speakers. So, you know, if this meeting was taking place with interpretation, I'd ask, you know, all the Swahili speakers, you know, maybe to group themselves over here, and I'd have the interpreter sit, you know, at that corner where they can hear everybody in their little group. Or maybe if there's a larger group, you know, the interpreter is sitting right here. So just being mindful of the space and making sure that everybody can hear each other. During the meeting, you want to speak directly to the person, not to the interpreter. So don't say, oh, tell her this, just speak to the person, almost ignoring the interpreter, because that's who you're trying to communicate with. If there are two parents, make sure that both understand. So, you know, if one, it seems like the other person is more proficient in English or even fluent, if there's another parent that's there and not understanding at all, it is important to get that interpreter and make sure that that communication is happening for all parties. Speak at a moderate pace, so not too fast, but also not so slow that it's like hard to track what you're saying. So just a moderate pace is best. Speak in short, manageable phrases, like we were discussing with the plain language. And pause between sentences for time. So I would recommend not more than 2 or 3 sentences at a time. And then avoid asides or rambling. So this is where that script can help, or just, you know, trying to stick with the agenda and having that clear focus. And then of course, use plain language. All right, so we're gonna actually watch an example. During COVID, we recorded all of our classes for students to watch. And so you're gonna see Amanda, the teacher, speaking in English, and then the interpreter, Veronica, interpreting. And so I just wanted you to be able to hear an example for a minute or two. Should I try it? Yeah. Okay.
Can I be the one to share that? Sorry to interrupt, because we can't hear.
Yes, let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that the person on Zoom can be the one to share, because they were having some trouble with that. So thank you. Go ahead, Charlotte. Thank you. We're having trouble hearing the sound.
They can just go back and watch the video later. Like this is huge. Yeah, I think some of those videos.
Yes, we were able to hear. Thank you.
This is what the future will look
like. So sorry.
Can we just switch back and watch it later?
Yeah, we can. All right, thank you. Sorry. I'll go ahead and share.
All right, that was just a very brief example, but what did you notice about how she was utilizing that interpreter? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just reminded that sometimes I interpret for our building because I speak Spanish.
Okay.
And sometimes it takes more words in Spanish to say something than it does in English. And maybe that's just me trying to explain it. some complicated term that maybe is not easily translated, but that's what I noticed, more words.
Yes, thank you for noting that. That is usually my experience as well with the Burmese and Swahili, so that's good to know. Anything else that you noticed?
It was helpful to pause after each question.
Yes.
Yeah, it's easier to translate if you have chunks of information than if a big thing is said and then you have to translate a bunch of information.
Anything else about that? You know, you'll notice that not just what she was saying, but what was on the screen was pretty simple in her slideshow. So those word choices, and again, the pace is just slower. You know, she spoke at a moderate pace. And then like when we plan our lesson, time, gotta wrap up. Okay, last thing I'll say, so we'll plan an hour of content for a 2-hour class, because you're gonna have double the time with that consecutive interpretation. So just being patient, that's a challenge for us because we have to condense. It basically makes us be like, okay, what is the most important information that people are gonna have? So that is a challenge.
But I was gonna say, maybe that extra time, like, because we weren't understanding for the students who don't speak both languages, you have more time to think about what's being said, especially if it's visual as well as oral, then you're like absorbing what are those 3 objectives for a longer period of time. So maybe some time is wasted in the translation, but also there's more time for reflection and processing for the students who don't need the translation.
I really, thank you for sharing that. I actually hadn't thought of that before, but that's a strength of a multilingual space. So thanks for sharing that. Okay. All right, so we're at 11:50. I think we need to head out.
10:50, yeah.
So maybe on the way you can think about, you know, what did you learn? What skills will you put into practice? And what do you want to learn more about? So that's what I'll leave you with.
All right. Thank you again for being here. I think, we'll probably have, it takes about, 5-10 minutes to drive to the farm. So if people need to use the restroom, are there any final questions or any last things before we kind of all go ahead and, wrap up things? Yes, thank you.